Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. It's different time zones for everybody attending the Access Agile Festival. My name is Andrea Pratt-Smith, and I am the Access Agile Festival ambassador for the beautiful country of the Bahamas. This is our third and last session for today, and we are pleased to have Dr. Rochelle Haynes with us. Before I introduce our speaker, there is one bit of housekeeping that I am required to carry out as the ambassador, and that's to let you know that the Access Agile Festival has a strict zero tolerance policy against any type of harassment. So if you are aware of any harassment or you're being harassed yourself, please notify myself or any of the other ambassadors or organizers. And we also have a website that you can report any incidents of harassment. With that being said, let me go ahead and introduce our speaker for this event. Dr. Rochelle Haynes is a published author, global speaker, coach, and consultant, and senior lecturer. She holds a PhD in International Human Resource Management and is the founder and CEO of Proud Potential Consulting, Inc. Rochelle's passion lies in applying good people management practices within the growing digital economy, and she was recently recognized by Forbes for her global study exploring co-working spaces and globally dispersed workers. She specializes in GigHR, a term she coined to describe the discipline of using HRM to help companies enhance their working relationships with contract or gig workers, digital nomads, and other offsite stakeholders whose physical contact with organizations is limited or non-existent. Dr. Rochelle Haynes, welcome to the Access Agile Festival. And even though you are Barbadian, you are representing the Bahamas very well. Thank you very much.
I try. So I think I'm representing 3 countries tonight: Barbados, UK, and the Bahamas. But of course, we know I'm biased to the Caribbean, naturally. So welcome to everyone that's joined us. Welcome to the Agile Festival. And hopefully you've enjoyed a lot of these sessions that you had to the end. We'll take something away from this one as well. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides, and then we'll just get started. Let me just put that on slideshow, and we are good to go. Get that little speaker box out of the way. Yes. All right. Let me just change the view here. So that's a little better. Okay, perfect. All right, so what I'm sharing today with you is a framework that I came up with as a result of the global study that Andrea mentioned. This was a global study that we started in 2018 and became very relevant in 2020. It was relevant before then, but at the time we were describing it as a silent revolution. So I'll get into that a bit more. But this presentation is is going to be all about that gig framework that we came up with and why we came up with this idea as well. So I have about 30 minutes. And I'll go through that bit by bit, and then we can ask any questions at the end. Or feel free as well to put your questions. There's a question section in the Zoom chat. Feel free to ask your questions there or comment in the chat as well. All right, so welcome again. And what we're going to be targeting here is just identifying some of the key trends to see why we even needed this framework in the first place, and look at some of the challenges that Agile talent, which some of yourself might be as well, may experience. And when I use Agile here, I'm using it in a very loose way. I know when we hear Agile, we think Agile methodologies and so forth. But when I use Agile here, I'm referring to atypical staff who are workers who are location independent, workers who are on part-time contracts, workers who are independent or might even be full-time, but they just don't work in the same physical location as the company, or maybe that's on an off and on basis. So we're going to look at some of the challenges that are faced by Agile talent, again loosely, and looking at how we can help HR and how we can help management effectively engage a workforce that is becoming more mixed. And it's kind of changing more and more what we mean by the term diversity, which I'll get into it. So just a little bit about myself. So this picture you see here is from when we conducted this study. So I spent a good part of a year going to different parts of Asia. This is in Thailand, and these are people that I met in a co-working center. Graphic designer, PhD student, engineer. And really my role there was just to experience what it was like to work in a location independent way. And from these co-working spaces, which at the time were, co-working spaces have probably been around for a while now, but they've really been increasing. Well, the year I went, this was 2019, they were really starting to become more normalized, or quite normalized at that point, but particularly in Asia. So my aim as a person who's interested in this topic was to find out what it is that is causing more and more people to want to work in this agile way. Why are people sacking in the office? Why are people deciding that actually I don't want to be full-time, but I want to work for the same company or a different company or multiple companies, but just in a way where I can control my own flexibility. So I spent 5 weeks in Thailand as a digital nomad. I also spent some time in Indonesia, in Jakarta and in Bali, just exploring these centers, talking to persons that work like this. And also I spoke to HR managers to find out what exactly are the conflicts they face when they work with people who are not necessarily on location. So remember, again, this was in 2018. And you can probably tell from the type of study that I did that this was probably one of the most enjoyable research projects. Literally, I was meeting people by taking yoga classes and going to the beach and going to co-working centers. So it was quite an enjoyable research project. So one of the things that we found, as I said, we called it a silent revolution back in 2018. And what we meant by that was that we were seeing a rise in people that were choosing to work remotely or people that were choosing to work independently. So this was for several reasons, and we have some of the reasons listed here. The rise of the gig economy, so these online platforms which acted as mediators between the employer or worker and the employee. You also had, with digital adoption, with increase in advanced technology, which allowed us to work in different ways, facilitating that increase. People saying, well, what's the point? Why do I have to go into the office and commute if I can work remotely? And even before the pandemic, there's a very famous company called Centric Consulting. They were a fully remote company 20 years ago. So this has now exploded, but there are companies that were already doing this. But in terms of that explosion with the pandemic as well, and that need to make sure that you have that well-being and make sure that you are catering for your employees, there was also a lot more companies thinking of, well, how can we ensure that we give our employees what they want so they don't leave? And I guess you guys would have heard of the Great Resignation and seeing how organizations are now fighting to keep their talent. It's almost a new war for talent. So these are just some of the reasons that we explored pre and post. I can't even say post-COVID, it's still kind of going on. But in terms of when we started this study, it was with this aim, just this shift that we were seeing in worker expectations, to shift away from the 9 to 5 and that demand for more autonomous roles. So I mentioned that new war for talent. And I guess if many of you work in the tech industry, you're probably familiar with this already. And you're probably aware that a lot of tech companies, along with other companies, especially financial firms as well, are fighting to keep their talent, because not only with changing work expectations, but with the pandemic, persons are now choosing to leave their jobs. They're choosing jobs that will allow them to work more flexibly and so forth. So with this new war for talent, it really demands that our typical approach to HR, our typical approach to engaging employees has to change along with those shifting expectations. And what we saw in the past was this demand, or this, let's see, this, how will I describe it? Just this emphasis that the best way to be productive was in the office. And if you work in an agile way, if you work remotely, you know that's not always the case. So where we're seeing employees choosing to leave firms and this rise in atypical work, HR is now finding itself forced to reconfigure the way they do things in order to be, let's say, more appealing to staff. And I think another reason for my interest in this topic was because I'm both an academic and a practitioner. And when I first started this topic, the biggest thing I was seeing was that what I was teaching in the classroom wasn't quite keeping pace with what I was seeing in industry and what I was experiencing with clients. And I always want my teaching to be relevant to students. So what I chose to do was to explore how the workforce was shifting. And we just see, oh, we have a little display issue. Anyhow, moving on. What I chose to do was to, in doing this study, try to find out the type of work people were gravitating towards and the ways in which they were working. So here I just outlined the different types of workers that companies are now managing in one space collectively. And with this, while this is good that employees and workers have much more options in terms of the way that they work, there were also a lot of issues that came along with this. And I've just highlighted a few of those issues here in terms of both what the company experiences and what workers experience. And some of these issues we identified from the global study that we did. So in terms of the company side, the more companies were working with independent contractors, the more companies were choosing to allow employees to work remotely. One of the biggest things that we kept seeing among clients were that they felt that they were losing control over the work process. And with that, because of that, what we were finding was that they were choosing to micromanage more. And this, of course, if you are shifting from, let's say, a full-time role or a role where you don't have much control over your job to an independent role, and the client is trying to micromanage you, that, of course, will cause some conflict. We also had clients concerned about visibility, about poor hiring, which is still very much a concern, and incomplete work. Also, information sharing is still a big concern for a lot of clients. And also the increased cost of contingent work. As again, as we said, that new war for talent it's taken a change, but it's definitely back. But on the worker side, and it's quite interesting because we highlight both the company and the workers' roles. But what we were seeing from speaking to workers was that the companies, let's say, poor management, or let's say lack of knowledge about how to manage employees in a space where you have such a mix of workers on different types of contracts. What we were finding was that because companies were not effectively managing those who were remote or independent, it was affecting the work produced by these independent individuals or these remote persons who were then suffering the consequences. So for example, one of the studies that the study that we did, and among other studies as well, which confirmed our results, kept showing that clients typically have higher work expectations for persons who work remotely or persons who work independently. But in addition to having higher expectations, or I would say paradox to that, is that they provided very little support for Agile talent. Half of the time they hired Agile talent for roles that they actually didn't want. So one of the things our study showed, for example, was that constantly someone, let's say you want a marketing manager, you're trying to hire a person to manage your marketing. However, when that person gets into the role, although they've been hired as a social media marketing manager, when they get into the role, what they realized was that the client actually wanted an admin assistant or a virtual assistant. So this lack of clear roles, the high expectations, little support and training around what the company wants, but also little communication. So some clients, for example, couldn't get through to the people that they needed to do in order to complete the job. And then, of course, they suffered the consequences. They were seen as not completing in time and so forth. So things like these were constant issues that kept coming up in our study. Also, because of these issues, it limited the co-workers or the independent contractor or the worker, let's just say the worker. It limited their ability to get future opportunities from that company and sometimes other companies. But it's not to say that the companies have all the power. As we said, we're in a case of this new war for talent. And where that was the case, we found more and more employees and workers saying, actually, they're no longer going to work or pay these companies or accept requests from companies who manage this relationship poorly. So the companies in that way also suffered in terms of who they could recruit. Also, something I wasn't looking for, but I found, was that discrimination was also an issue in the online space. So we had a lot of women, especially, and a lot of ethnic minorities saying that they felt that they were judged in the online space differently and not always for the quality of their work. And that showed particularly where, let's say, a particular online worker, they might have gone from a more local field of working to a more international field. So these were issues that we really wanted to address. So what we did was, based on our analysis, based on our findings, and based on our work with clients and what clients were saying were their pain points, we came up with a framework that we call GigHR. And gig really just to represent that sort of, it's a word that we use loosely to mean, let's say, those who work independently, who take gigs or jobs online, or persons who work, it might be fully remotely or they have their own firm, but it's primarily done in a remote way. And what we sought to do with the GigHR framework was to redefine the relationship that companies have with persons that they work with in this kind of setting. Because it's not just an issue of they're not effectively managing, let's say, their independent workers. It was that when independent workers were working with persons in-house in that company, that in itself was causing an issue, because they might not have been aware sometimes of the person that is meant to be on their team, or the relationship and how to manage that relationship, and sought to do it in the same way that they would manage an in-house person. So this GigHR framework was really to redefine that relationship and to provide HR with a map, let's say, of how they can go about that. And I have here rules, tools, skills, and thrills, because this is the four main components, or the four main rooms in our GigHR framework. So what you see here on the screen is the framework that we came up with. And we chose to, when I say we, I'm speaking about myself and my business partner, Jeremy Blaine. What we chose to do was to represent this framework as a house. And we did that very deliberately, because we wanted to show that the workplace, or we wanted to convey this idea that work should create a safe space for employees. So this was very deliberate. And we started our GigHR framework on a foundation of gig culture, which is really thinking about your vision and values and how that is communicated to those persons that you're seeking to hire and how they're included in the organization. And then we have our roof of well-being, just again to indicate that idea of safety. Now, the four main components of this room, of this house, are the rules, the tools, the skills, and the thrills. I dare you to say it 5 times fast at the speed of lightning. Let me know how that goes. And on either side of the house, what we have here is what companies suffer when they don't manage the relationship right. So the gig shade. And on this side, gig shine. What happens when companies get it right? Now, I kind of did a whistle tour through that, because now I'm going to go into the rooms separately. But you can see some of the issues here in terms of stagnation of growth, biases and micromanagement, lack of flexibility, a blame culture, not being very inclusive. And where the business gets it right, a growth mindset, proper representation and feelings of belonging, empowerment of employees, and so forth. So I'm going to skip now to our rooms. And I'm watching time, Andrea, I ask you to prompt me if I do step over the time. But in terms of our gig rules, what we have here are basically, if it is that you want to manage a relationship where you have several workers on different contracts, then you have to ensure that you have set up your organization in a way that allows that. I had one of the companies I interviewed was a company called Insprint, and they were brilliant because they chose, rather than to have employees called, let's say in the US, you call independent contractors 1099s. And then you have your full-time employees and you have your part-time employees. The first thing they did was got rid of those different titles, and they created one title of unconsultants where everyone was represented and recognized within the firm. So the first thing that we wanted to indicate in the gig rules was making sure that companies could be set up to actually hire gig workers and have the correct protocols in place. And that begins by, first of all, thinking of your future work strategy and where, let's say, independent talent and full-time talent may have to work together in the future, or when you might need independent and full-time talent for specific jobs. And in creating that future work strategy, that would also be indicated through the protocols that are created that allows persons to work independently. And that can be a mixture of things, from creating contracts that allow for the flexibility, also creating mechanisms for where employees want to switch from, let's say, a full-time role to an independent role, making sure those sort of protocols are in place. And one of the things that makes that particularly valuable is that a lot of retirees want to continue working with the firms. And we've seen cases where clients don't have, let's say, mechanisms in place that allow them to do that. So they go and contract or consult for other firms. Also, in terms of managing the work experience and making sure that everyone feels adequately recognized within the workspace and creating a work habitat that facilitates independent and remote work. So for example, one of the things that we've recommended is providing discounts on memberships to co-working centers, or creating a hot desking system, or making sure that your induction process is actually suited for everyone. So I'm going to skip through that again because I'm watching the time. And then your gig tools, this room really just speaks to making sure that you have the tech and touch ecosystem in place that allows people to work in this way, whether that is through the communication platforms that you provide, the task platforms that allow also for engagement, but also what protocols do you have in place to monitor and measure the experience of gig workers, but also the experience of those who work with gig workers in your company. So it's really talking about having those systems in place that allow you to not just monitor, but empower your employees to work in more flexible ways. But on top of that, you also see here as well, making sure you have those safety precautions in place, because as we said, companies are very concerned in terms of security. I'm just going to tad faster because of the time. Anyway, in terms of the gig skills, what we were talking about here, what we created here was a learning and development roadmap to just give HR staff and management an idea of how their employers or how their staff, how their leadership may need to be retrained in order to facilitate gig work, not just for those who are working with let's say independent or remote individuals, but those who are managing them or those who might want to become gig workers. So it speaks of not only concentrating on the digital, but having a mixture of the digital and the human skill set. And one of the things that we've seen constantly, especially working with clients who were trying to, let's say, prompted by the pandemic to work more remotely and to digitally transform, one of the things that we saw was a lot of clients failed in that digital transformation process because they focused solely on the technical skills, like the toolkits, the platform, the literacy, without thinking about what is needed to adjust to this process. So that's why we combine this digital and human skills to come up with what we describe as phygital skills. And then finally, the gig thrill. Of our biggest findings were that a lot of gig workers or independent contractors or remote workers felt very unrecognized. They felt very invisible. And often that was because they weren't recognized within the company for their work. They weren't connected to persons within the companies. So the thrills really speaks about what you can put in place to make your entire staff feel recognized, whether or not that is online and offline networking events. We spoke about that very precise induction system. And one of the best practices we've seen companies who get this right do is perhaps send in welcome packs to their gig staff who might be in different locations, making sure that they have a voice and they understand who they can go to when they need help within the organization, and providing also opportunities for training. A lot of gigsters, I say, again, I use that very loosely, have said that they'd be interested in training, in company training and so forth. So whether that's in-house or offering discounts in online training, whatever the process, the idea here is to provide a way to integrate gig and independent staff with your full-time and in-house team, so everyone feels like their work is valued. What happened a lot of the time, and what we found, was that gig workers produced some really expert work and other in-house employees were given the credit for it. So in many cases, the workers chose never to work with that company again. So this gig thrills framework is just a a peek into what it would look like for a company to really create a culture of inclusivity for all types of workers. And we mentioned that that encourages companies to rethink the word diversity, because we're not just talking diversity in terms of race, gender, sex, marital status. We're now talking about diversity in in terms of the type of worker, the diversity of worker, and more studies are showing that persons who work online tend to feel less recognized or less valued, and in many cases are judged harder than persons that work in-house. They're seen as less committed online workers in many scenarios. So this really provides this roadmap of how employees can create a system where you're not just focusing on the digital and analytics, the robotics, all of the new, or just the cyber side of things or the technical side of things, but you want to also focus on providing those human elements that make that relationship feel more engaging, make employees feel more motivated. So I'm just going to wrap up there because I think I am 16 seconds over my 30 minutes, so I'll stop there. But if you have any questions, if you have any feelings about what I've said in terms of the gig framework and whether or not you think it would work for your company or otherwise, or if it's practical, please feel free to share. So I'll stop there for now. And Andrea, I pass back to you.
Thank you, Rochelle. I just took a bite of an apple, so I'm just trying to get something in for the day. It's been a long day, and these events have had me so pumped. You know, I didn't even realize that the time was going by so quickly, just jumping from one event to the next. Yeah. So do we have any questions from our audience? Does anyone have a question? Feel free to come off mute and let's have a conversation. Rochelle presented very quickly, but I hope that you caught that information.
I was so worried about going over the time.
No, don't worry about the time. I think we have an hour. I know it's 9 p.m., 9:30 p.m. in the UK and 4:30, just about 4:30 here in the Bahamas. So we're working with all these different time zones, and as you can imagine, it's exciting and interesting how we juggle all these different time zones for this event, but we make it happen and try to make it look as seamless as possible.
I think you're doing a great job.
So do we have any questions? Does anyone have a question?
Sure, I have a question. Did you find in any of your research that this does not wed well with particular industries or particular roles within an organization?
Yeah, we have found, and that's one of the things that we work with clients to do, to adapt it to the sectors. So we do find that certain industries experience challenges. So for example, when we work with clients from the insurance industry, they said in terms of some of their hiring practices, and this was in Asian markets particularly, they were saying in terms of their hiring practices and tax systems and so forth, that the protocols is often, or what we describe as the gig rules, is the biggest challenge. So what we often find with the gig framework is, depending on the client, depending on the company, there might be an emphasis more on a specific room in the gig framework than, let's say, the other rooms. And in many cases, with some firms, we found that the emphasis is more on helping them identify what protocols they need to set up to effectively hire gig workers, but also to get them incorporated into their teams. Or we've had cases, for example, where full-time employees wanted to work remotely from another country, and persons have had concerns around taxes and what that relationship might look like. So yeah, there are challenges depending on the industry that you're in. We just have some comments in the chat. No worries. Thank you guys for joining us. Have a good weekend. Any more questions?
How have you confronted the, I guess, the pushback of implementing this type of mindset to what people are traditionally doing? Is it easy to address this? Is it what tactics have you used in order to really get that engagement and make sure that this is a successful endeavor, not only for you as selling this, but as for them to implement it?
Yeah, a very good question. We definitely had some pushback, and often it's pushback from management that would say, well, this isn't very practical. And what we've done is to show examples, walk them through examples of where it has worked, or we start on a very small scale. We would say, okay, well, let's start with first creating this new protocol, for example. Let's see how this might work in your company, and let's get some feedback for your employees, and so forth. And once they see that employees are responding positively to it, and they see that it can actually work and the protocol goes smoothly, then they're willing and more open to try other elements of it. So we have some people that react very positively to it, and then others that think, okay, well, this won't work. But once we can show them that it can work, or once we can also indicate what will happen if it's not done, or what's currently happening in their company, then they're more open to it. So for example, we had a client where we had to walk them through, in terms of their recruitment process and their induction and their turnover, how not managing the relationship effectively has actually resulted in higher turnover for them, and how it's actually resulted in the struggles that they were facing in recruiting certain employees. So once they were able to see that, then they were more willing to embrace the framework.
Very interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Do we have any more questions before we conclude this event? Okay, so I'm going to take that as there's no more questions. Thank you so much, Dr. Rochelle Haynes, for taking time out of your schedule to participate in the Access Agile Festival. We thoroughly enjoyed you being a representation underneath the Bahamas banner. I'm so proud to say that, like, you're the second person from Barbados to actually be a part of the Bahamas banner. And so we're representing the whole Caribbean region. And so hopefully when the event happens again next year, we'll have a wider representation of more countries and islands in the Bahamas, and it'll be fantastic. So thank you so much for being a part of this one. We're making history, and we're just happy to be at the table of the Access Agile Festival. And a lot of persons, yes, a lot of persons are actually going to other events. So they have events going on well into the night. And it starts again early in the morning with the Australians and the Indians. So they kick off that side of the globe, and then we take over in the afternoon. So it's been very interesting. And I hope that you can catch a few of the events yourself and be a part of this Global Access Agile Festival. Thank you everyone for participating and for being a part of this event. And we will meet up again tomorrow is our final event, where my 10-year-old daughter will be presenting. She's the youngest presenter at the festival, and she's presenting on Agile and education, and she's gonna let everybody know how homeschooling is going. So she may let a few cats out of the bag about how mommy treats her with homeschooling. So we'll see how that goes. I'm kind of nervous about it because kids say the darndest things, right? So we'll see how that plays out tomorrow. So tomorrow at 11 is our event. And that's the final event underneath the Bahamas. But the events continue well into tomorrow night. And thank you everyone for joining us, and have a great rest of the evening or night to some of you. And that's it for us. Thank you so much.